Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Systems broadcast. I am your host, Mike, and on tonight's show, we are going to be discussing Italy coming for the citizens' gold. Yes, you heard me right. Italy has moved fast in an attempt to get the citizens' gold out of their pockets and into the public space so they can tax it, maybe confiscate it. Now, remember, confiscations of gold have happened many, many times in history. I've discussed it on the channel multiple times. I've got an article here on my Substack saying, are they going to come for your gold? Probably, but here's what you can do about it, because I do think we are going to see confiscations of gold. Why? Because this is what always happens at every single point in history. Once you get to the financial reset, they come for the gold. It's happened already in the US in 1933 when they took the citizens' gold, they bullied them, forced them, demanded of them to put their gold back into the US Treasury, and of course that gold disappeared. I've got some trustworthy information on that says it went to the Bank of International Settlements, or at least some of it did. However, that's not the point of tonight's show, but we do know historically it's happened many times. It happened in Australia, it happened in Great Britain, and it's going to happen again. And you'd be foolish to think that there isn't a risk. We don't know where it's going to happen, whether it's going to be everywhere or just somewhere, but I think somewhere is a good bet on this, and Italy is already moving to try and get their citizens to register their gold. Now, I've discussed this also, that they're going to make asset registries, because ultimately the goal going into a reset is to loot the citizens to pay for the debts of the nation, which are owed to private banks. And if you don't understand that, you will do after tonight's episode. But let's just go through what these proposals are. So it says here, Meloni's government eyes Italian family gold in hunt for budget funds. This is a desperate act, but it's also a dark act, because we know they really want to do this global asset register where everything's going to be tokenized, put on a digital ledger, and your property will no longer have ownership rights ascribed to it by the fact that you own it. It will be ascribed to the digital token, and they can move it around or indeed come and confiscate it if they decide that's what they want to do. And that's one of the subtexts to what Italy is doing here. But let's go through it. It says, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's government is looking to gold and its soaring value to raise more money for the public coffers as members of her right-wing coalition squabble over other elements of the budget. Now, what they're actually proposing is that people in Italy who have private gold holdings but don't have a deed of sale or a receipt showing where the gold comes from can pay a special one-time tax. Now, why is that? Well, if you have gold in Italy and you don't have a deed of sale or a receipt, when you sell it, you get taxed 26% on the entire holdings of gold. So 26% on the entire sum. So that would be, for example, if you've got a coin and it's worth 4,000 euros, then they will tax you 26% on the entire 4,000 euros. However, if you have a deed of sale, then you only pay 26% tax on the capital gains. So, for example, let's say you buy a 4,000 euro coin and it goes up to 4,400, you only pay the 26% on the 400 because that's the increase. It makes sense. So that's how they're doing it over in Italy. And what they're proposing now is that this undocumented gold, that's how they term it. And I'm like, well, it's meant to be undocumented. You don't have a right to know what your citizens own. This isn't meant to be like a greenhouse where you can look in and see everything that people own. We know that's what they want, but that's how they're making it seem that the citizens are somehow incriminated by not having some receipts. Because remember, a lot of gold is passed on intergenerationally through families. Smart ancestors of yours might have been very clever and thought, you know what, these governments are looting us with all of this funny money. I'm going to put some in gold, and then passed it on because they didn't need to use it because they were super smart. That's, of course, the goal for most families, is to pass on wealth, not to squander it in one single lifetime. But that would mean that you wouldn't have any receipts. You wouldn't have any sales receipts. And remember, a lot of gold actually used to be money. So you might have families in Italy that have old gold lira, and there wouldn't be a sales receipt for that because it was being used as money. It's money. So you don't actually get a receipt for money. And that gold could still exist. But they're now taking it out as though that gold could be somehow, part of a criminal enterprise. So what they're saying to citizens is, if you tell us the gold holdings you have, we'll allow you to pay right now a 12.5% tax on the worth of the gold. So just think about this for a second. This is an unrealized gain tax. They're not telling you to sell the gold. They're saying, you tell us what gold you have. We'll value it. We'll mark it to market. So let's say it's 20 ounces of gold. They'll say, well, 20 ounces of gold. Let's look at the spot price. Here's what it's worth. Now you can pay 12.5% tax on the total holdings you have told us about. We'll give you a special certificate stamped with Georgia Maloney's lipstick. She'll give it a nice kiss for you. And then when you sell the gold, you'll only have to pay the 26% tax on capital gains. So they're basically saying, let us tax you now so we can tax you later, but we won't tax you quite as heavily later. And also, we'll have a big register of whoever owns the gold. Now, this isn't the first time Italy has come for the citizens' gold. If you go back to Italy's experience of fascism, in 1935 and 1936, there was actually a movement in Italy. Get this. This is how dumb people can be, where the government at the time, which was led by fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, he said, we want all citizens, and it was only women back then who had wedding rings, we want all citizens, all the females, to hand over their gold wedding rings for the fatherland, and we will hand you a nice, shiny iron ring if you trade it over. And this is going to be a sacrifice for the nation. Please do it. And guess what? Lots and lots of people did it. Even the Queen pretended, of course, she never handed over her gold ring, but even the Queen Elena, pretended to hand over a ring as propaganda to get the citizens to do it. Now, apparently 10 million rings weighing 55 tons, but it was 55 tons of gold apparently was rounded up. And it says in late November 1935, Italians in the United States also were sending their rings across to Italy for Mussolini to melt down. Now, just think about what that means. That means that in the US, they were allowing this to take place, knowing that a fascist dictator was ruling Italy at the time. Of course, the war hadn't started, but there was groups of Americans turning up for these parties where they'd all hand over their gold rings, get given this crappy iron ring. I mean, oh, how embarrassing that. Imagine 20 years later, 30 years later, looking down at your hand long after Mussolini had been slaughtered by his own people and seeing that piece of crap ring and knowing you handed over your gold ring to the fascist dictator. What a shame. But that's what people did. And it says in cities with large Italian-American populations like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, between 3,000 and 4,000 people donated. Elaborate remarriage ceremonies were held. So people actually went through a second ceremony where they'd take off the old ring and now they'd get given this other ring. And I think it was inscribed with something on it like for the fatherland or something stupid like this. But this shows you that propaganda and psychological conditioning can work on people at all iterations throughout history. And I think it's working right now. Just look at all of the people that are following all of the different narratives because they're being told to incessantly. That's how propaganda works. Firstly, it's absurd, then it's ridiculed, then it's accepted, and it becomes fact in the end. And that's the way it worked. So apparently in the US, in less than 6 months, more than 100,000 American wives sent their wedding rings to Mussolini in Italy. Now, it's not just that issue too. We've got another one here. This is the US document links Vatican to Nazi gold. I've done research on this in the past. I'm not going to go through it. And remember, the Vatican is its own separate city-state, but it was Mussolini who gave the Vatican its city-state status. Before that, the Pope was locked up in the Vatican for about 70 years, and then Mussolini gave them a massive payout of gold, which they then used at the bottom of the Great Depression to buy up a load of stocks and turn themselves into one of the most richest entities in the world, and they also created the Vatican Bank. Now, the Vatican Bank during World War II, well, they wound up with a lot of Nazi gold because it's the most private bank in the world. Now, bearing in mind, like I said, this isn't Italy, but I just thought I'd throw that one in there. And then there was this too. There was this as well. So, Italy minister, the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini said on Monday that the idea of plugging budget holes by using the country's gold reserves, which are held by the Bank of Italy, could be a good idea. So what's all this about? Well, back in the 2010s, Italy also considered selling the gold of the nation. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. I'm going to share this article with you. We're going to go through it because it brings out some really interesting points that I think most people are not aware of. It says in 2009 and 2019, so twice, attempts were made to take control of the gold stock managed by the Banca d'Italia in order to rescue the state of Italian public finances. Now, bearing in mind, this is the central bank that is supposedly, this is what we're told in every nation, the central bank is supposedly just another branch of the government, but it's got its independence. That's what we're told. We know it's BS, and it's the case here in Italy. So the merger of three banks is what created the Banca d'Italia. It began in 1893, and it was the Banca Nazionale Toscana, the Banca Toscana di Credito, and the Banca Nazionale del Regno d'Italia. And at the time, they had 78 tons of gold. Over the next 100 years, they managed to accumulate a massive amount. In fact, Italy are the third official largest holders of gold in the world. We're talking the gold held by the nation, and it's over 2,000 tons. So what happened was the Italian government said, well, our finances suck. We keep lending all this money from the bank at interest. Why don't we use the gold that the central bank have and we'll sell it or we'll tax them on it? We'll either sell it, we'll just take it and sell it outright and then use it to pay back the central bank or to plug fiscal spending for the government. I think that's more likely what they wanted to do, was to just try and save the nation's spending somehow because they keep having to lend the money. Or another idea was that they was going to tax the unrealized gains on the central bank. Now, just think about what that would mean for a second. If you tax the unrealized gains on the gold held by the central bank, which is effectively what they're trying to do with the citizens now, that's why I brought this up. What you're asking the central bank to do is to monetize the gold in a sense, because the currency doesn't exist. The central bank's going to have to print the currency, but rather than give it to you at interest, they're giving it to you based off of the increased price in gold holdings. Now, we've discussed this in relation to the US this year. That's one of the things that they could do, is mark the gold to market, which isn't quite the same, but it is in a sense. They're still going to have to create money out of nothing. Now, in Italy, what this really revealed to me was that the nation doesn't really have that gold. The central bank and the nation are not one and the same. If it was, the nation, the government, could say, oh yeah, we want the gold. But because it's separate, because the gold is being held by the central bank can refuse. And that's precisely what happened. But in this instance, the European Central Bank also stepped in and they said, well, we ain't allowing this. And what it really speaks to is that the central banks have their own independence completely. They're private. You cannot get the gold back from them. The gold that is put up with the central bank by the nation is collateral on the national debt. And that's actually how I think they will come for the citizens' gold. That's why the US confiscated gold in 1933. It was because they was defaulting on their national debt, and the central bank say, well, you better put up more collateral. And last time it was the citizens' gold. This time it will probably be the same. There will be central banks that demand, this is done behind the scenes, but they'll demand that the citizens' gold is confiscated. And it could be national parks too. We've heard about this, natural asset companies, which is where they take the national parks and they start to monetize them through all kinds of Frankenstein accounting, where they basically start to mark up things like carbon capture or photosynthesis, and they start to actually account these as somehow having a financial value, and they want to list then these natural asset companies that are based off of these natural processes. This sounds crazy, I know, but trust me, this is what the US have actually already tried to push through. It only didn't work because the SEC wouldn't allow it, but they're going to try again. In fact, they're setting up to try again. So this, my friends, is how they're going to try and get people to expose their assets to the system. They're going to give you some kind of special deal, a bargain. And in Italy, one of the politicians said, and this was very rich coming from a politician, it said, it makes sense. People have to think about it and the cost. So yeah, no thanks. That's what I think most citizens will say. And if you go back to 1933 with the American gold confiscation, only 25% of citizens actually put their gold into the system. Now, the big problem there, of course, is not that the government are going to get you gold. If you don't hand it over, they don't get the gold, but it makes the gold illiquid, right? And therefore, you need to have a really good understanding of laws, of legality around gold, because not all gold was illegal. For example, your gold wedding band, even if it was 24 karat gold or a gold necklace, that was not considered monetary gold. And that is what they're coming for, because we know they're going to reset the system and they're going to monetize gold. In fact, just take a look at this. Senator Dario Damiani, a member of Forza Italia and a backer of the proposal, said the program aimed to, and I quote, encourage the monetization of gold held by Italians. Now, what does that mean? That's something that a lot of people have glossed over, but I wouldn't be so fast to, because that's very specific language. Monetization, the gold held by Italians, by private citizens. If you know your past gold confiscations, you would know that every single time they did it, it was aimed at monetizing the gold, because they can actually do this quite easily, legally speaking, if gold is considered money. Why? Because it's national security. If they need the gold to deal with some kind of fiscal crisis, there are usually things already on the books that enable them to do it. In 1933, when they came for the Americans' gold, it was exactly that enabled them to do it. It's because gold was money. So they said, we need to recall the money to bail out the system, because everyone's in a Great Depression. We need more money on account at the Treasury so the Federal Reserve can issue more paper notes. It was a lie, of course. They retracted the money supply substantially prior to this so that they could use that as the rationale for stealing the gold. But my point is, whenever they start to use that language, you start to think back to past confiscations. In the UK, they came for legal tender. So they said, oh, we need gold that's legal tender. And not many people know this, but the gold sovereign is a legal tender coin. The gold Britannia today, if you buy a gold Britannia, which is the 1 ounce gold coin or half ounce gold coin, or the silver ones even, they're legal tender. They are literally legal tender. Look at them. They've actually got a face value. In America, American Eagles, American Buffaloes, they are legal tender. In Canada, the 1 ounce maple leaf, gold and silver, that's legal tender. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means there are actually already legislative acts that enable them to recall them at any times. I've done episodes on this called Coins of the Realm, and that's precisely what this article goes into as well. That there is actually a lot of hidden legislation that people don't know about that would enable them to recall the gold at any time. Now, I'm not saying they're going to do this, but looking at what's happening in Italy and seeing the language of this, it does make one think, doesn't it? So I would definitely recommend checking that article out. I'll put the link below. But I'm going to leave it there for tonight's episode, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know in the comments section if you would be telling the Italian government, if you live there, about your gold and getting your special bonus tax, or if you would be waiting it out. I'd love to know. And also, do you think we're going to see this in other nations too, like I do? Let me know in the comment section which nation you think will be first in the West outside of Italy. That'll be an interesting one, and maybe we'll discuss it in a future live stream. In closing, take care of yourselves. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.